It is debatable how much military impact the United States had during the First World War. They undoubtedly had the potential to be one of the most important participants, having a larger population than Germany and an unrivaled economy, and if America joined the war in 1914, there would quite simply be no hope for German victory following the failure of the Schlieffen Plan. Yet in our own timeline, America only got significant boots on the ground during 1917, at which point Russia had already collapsed, and following one final desperate offensive by the Germans, all hope was lost for a Central Powers victory, and during 1918 they collapsed. Whether or not the absence of American forces would have made the difference is an often discussed topic in alternate history. But militarily speaking, I don't consider the Americans to have made the decisive difference during this final crucial front. The Germans were already in economic crisis, they had failing logistics, and crucially, they had to desperately push across no man's land in an offensive maneuver, while the Entente had the luxury of time on their side, being able to simply hold as they knew that soon American forces would bolster their flanks, while every German death was one that they could scarcely replace. But it's often forgotten that American involvement in the war went beyond just this final side note during the war. Throughout the war, the Americans were quite firmly leaning towards the side of the Entente, giving out generous loans to France and Britain, supplying them with weapons both in the open and in secret, cutting trade with Germany while increasing trade with the Entente, etc. Despite America not being involved in the war, one cannot really speak of a neutral US during the early portions of the war. So what if this changed? What if America decided that it would be truly neutral? America decides that it has no bone to pick with either the Germans or the British, considering that both make up huge populations within the nation. And as long as both sides respect America's sovereignty, America will be neutral in all aspects. But before we dive into the scenario, I would like to introduce our first ever sponsor, Historical Wear. Historical Wear is a shop that has a lot of history-themed clothing products for everyone interested in history. The options range from Roman-themed rings to hoodies that for only $26 will make you look exactly like your favorite historical figures. You can reenact the stabbing of Caesar, or you can show up at a party with you and your best friends Napoleon and Wellington cosplay. Even Bismarck famously wore this German Empire beanie while he was unifying Germany. Historical Wear is currently running a 35% off everything sale, so go check out Historical Wear from the link in the description and let's go on with the video. But we have several extremely difficult problems to solve if we want to save realism in this scenario. The first is German submarine warfare. If Germany still decides on unrestricted submarine warfare against American shipping, there is simply no way that America doesn't cut ties with Germany, especially when American civilians are among the casualties. Perhaps a deal could be reached between the Americans and the Germans, protecting American shipping from German submarines attacks in exchange for America continuing and increasing trade with the Germans. This would essentially kill the entire purpose of the U-boat effort right off the bat, since neutral and Entente nations could now also start flying the American flag. This would likely result in Germany massively downscaling their submarine production, since ensuring German trade with America is worth more than an untested attempt to starve Britain. But there is also a second issue. Even if America wanted to, it couldn't fully continue trade with the Germans thanks to a British blockade of the German coast. The German submarine effort was a way of attempting to disrupt the British trade in the same way the British were disrupting German trade. In a fully realistic scenario, American dreams of trading with Germany during the war would be dashed thanks to this British blockade. But, for the sake of this scenario, we will assume that the American government strong-arms the British into allowing American passage through the blockade. How? By threatening to cut American trade with Britain if they don't. Because the British economy during the war could barely function without the US. The US provided a significant amount of the British food supply, and Britain relied on imports for almost 80% of their wheat supply. Adding to that, the US was the most important exporter of raw materials to Britain, which allowed the British economy to switch and further focus on producing war equipment and munitions. The US, in total, accounted for about 33% of British import, and were this to dry up, Britain would be massively impacted. So, we now have America strong-arming both Britain and Germany into achieving American free trade in the Atlantic. Let's now dive into the war. The start still goes largely the same way. The Germans almost take Paris but fail, there is trench warfare in the west, while the Russians fail to inflict much damage upon Germany. The British then attempt to blockade the German coast, after which we have the American diplomatic maneuvering ensuring American passage through the blockade. And this loophole in the British blockade has massive impacts on the German economy during World War I. The British blockade was devastating, forcing the German military to take quite inefficient, direct control over key industries, while decimating the German industrial class and slowly strangling the German food supply. With the seas open for American shipping, Germany starts to increasingly rely on American imports, much to Britain's annoyance. So, right off the bat, we have significantly altered the economic side of the war. Thanks to, in large part, the British blockade, German GDP declined by almost a quarter during the war, while Britain's GDP only rose. This alternate Germany is significantly more powerful economically, while Britain is slightly weaker than in our own timeline since they have to compete with German imports. Meanwhile, America is benefiting greatly, with American exports becoming extremely expensive as both Germany and Britain are paying extreme premiums in an attempt to prevent the exports from reaching their opponents. But, for Germany's sake, even more importantly, America is now practically their only trading partner, meaning that they have to pay whatever the American traders demand. But the following years would, on the large scale, see the war progress largely as it did in our own timeline, with Germany clearly being on the winning hand. Not only is Germany holding lands in the west, Russia is in no position to contest the Germans in the east, the Balkans have been pacified, Italy is being held at the Alps, and the only European front the Central Powers weren't winning was in the Caucasus. Meanwhile, and this is the important contrast to our own timeline, Germany and the Central Powers are largely capable of feeding their population and war machine thanks to American imports. And then we reach the most crucial year in the war. 1917 is absolutely devastating for the Entente. The Tsar of Russia is deposed and replaced with a Republican government, which is then replaced with the Bolsheviks, who will eventually make peace with the Germans in 1918. After this peace is signed, Germany still needs significant forces to garrison their new holdings in the east, but it can now start siphoning forces to the Western Front. But on the Western Front, things are not necessarily in favor of the Germans. Sure, Germany can now largely focus on this front, and over time, German food security will massively increase thanks to their gains in the east, but the Germans are still extremely restricted by their population. With just the European territories, Germany has fewer men than France and Britain combined, obviously, and the Ottomans and the Austrians are too busy to reinforce the German lines. But, zooming out on the world stage, it should be clear that the Entente has one more major advantage. Discounting America from this map, the Entente controls about half of the world. French and British colonials can reinforce the Western Front, supplement industrial roles, and supply resources. Meanwhile, the Entente was further ahead in technology that may just be able to smash trench warfare, like airplanes and tanks. Even despite American neutrality, German military victory is by no means guaranteed. Which is where we need to discuss, in my opinion, the most important American intervention on the side of the Entente, which wouldn't happen in this alternate timeline. No, I'm not talking about American boots on the ground, I'm talking about American money. From 1914 to 1917, Britain was the treasury of the Entente powers. Not only did it pay for its own war costs, its allies were hopelessly economically unprepared for sustained war. Britain fully subsidized Italy's war budget and up to 2/3 of the French and Russian budgets, not to mention many of the minor powers of the Entente. Did Britain have enough money to do this? Not really. By 1917, Britain has exhausted most of their gold reserves, foreign investments, loan credit, and more. There simply isn't infinite money in the world, and the Brits had just about ran out of ways to raise more without starting to collapse their own economy. But then America stepped in, loaning the British $4 billion directly from the US Treasury, which was about enough to pay for 2 years of British wartime spending. From this point onwards, the US took on the role that Britain previously held in subsidizing the Entente war effort by taking on loans themselves. This obviously wouldn't happen in this alternate timeline, which has terrible implications for the future war effort of the Entente, since there is little incentive for the few remaining private investors to loan to the Entente directly. Germany has just defeated Russia and is building up for an offensive in the West, and there seems to be little the Entente can do to turn the tide in this war without direct American intervention. Now imagine you're someone seeking to loan out your money not for patriotic reasons, but because you want to make your money back and more. Any money you just loaned to the Russians has been wiped out, and it's difficult to see Britain and France winning the war anytime soon. Do you want to risk your money on what's seemingly the losing side in this global war? By 1917, the Entente, slowly, starts running out of responsible ways to raise money. This doesn't mean that in 1917 the Entente suddenly collapses, but what this does do is that the Entente is less capable to compete for exports, massive inflation starts to erode the public consumption capacity, and priorities have to be set for Entente spending. Is it worth the money to keep blockading Germany, since American ships can still come through anyways? How much money is there for research and development? Is the Middle Eastern side theater really worth it? As economic issues start to rock the Entente during 1917 and 18, the Entente has many difficult questions to answer about how and if they can continue the war. Now, don't get me wrong, Germany is by no means doing great economically, but when compared to our own timeline, Germany is doing just fine. Germany cannot keep this war up forever either, but in our own timeline, they were still managing in 1917, and they are now stronger economically, and they are by far the favorites to win this war, giving them much more options for loans. Adding to this, Germany is an autocracy with a large military tradition. The German population, especially since they are rejoicing their constant victories in the war, are likely slightly more capable of withstanding economic decline. Now, we have two options here. With Germany on less of a time pressure and the war continuing for a couple more years, Germany can remain on a careful defensive position while slowly getting more resources from their occupations in the east. Eventually, the Entente will be unable to compete with the Central Powers and their lines will collapse. The alternative, and what I consider more likely, is that somewhere in 1918-1919, the Entente, now that they are still somewhat militarily capable, attempt to negotiate a peace. And for everyone which is going to say that there is no way that the Entente would ever just surrender, consider their situation at this point. Economic collapse, Russian Revolution, America is not coming to help, and there is no sign of Germany falling anytime soon. The route to victory for the Entente is seemingly impossible without Russia or the US to supplement their forces or distract the Germans. I will personally put my money on an armistice in 1919, as all the Entente issues compound and hit them directly in the face. So, how would a potential peace deal look? Let's start in the east. Firstly, the German protectorates over formerly Russian lands are now affirmed by the Entente, solidifying Germany's new role as hegemon over Eastern Europe. The Balkans are then reorganized. A massive Bulgaria is created, while the Ottomans gain control over the Caucasus and formerly Greek islands. The remaining Balkan states are little more than German-Austrian puppets. Italy itself would likely not receive too harsh of a peace deal. Austria wasn't really in a position to directly take more land in the region, and Germany would have little interest there. Italy would likely have to pay massive war reparations and possibly lose their colonies to Germany. Staying on Africa, it's unlikely that the Germans get any territory from the British, since Britain still had a strong navy and Germany was in no position to directly threaten them. It's in Germany's best interest to achieve peace with Britain as well, so it's more than likely that Britain gives little more to the Germans than some symbolic war goals like minor war reparations. Meanwhile, Germany would strip the Belgians off the Congo and expand their holdings across formerly French Africa. Germany may also receive some Pacific and Caribbean islands to satisfy German desires for an empire under the sun. Then finally, we have the most important part of the peace deal: Western Europe. The Germans would likely push their border to the Meuse, taking lands in eastern France. While it may look like a minor change on the map, these territories were some of the richest coal and iron producing regions in France, which is obviously crucial for not just industrial development, but military development as well. Belgium, now greatly reduced in size, would become little more than a German puppet, while France would be saddled with so much war debt that they would essentially be turned into an economic dependency of Germany, never to reach the height of great power again. Something like this, I predict, would be the final map going into the 1920s. The details may be different, like Ireland being independent, German involvement into the Russian Civil War, etc., but this is the rough outline. But despite how great Germany's new empire may look on the map, the post-war period will be devastating for Germany. They have won the war, but their economy has massively suffered. They will now also have to start repaying their enormous war debts to the Americans and German banks. But perhaps most importantly, in contrast to our own timeline where the Entente took relatively little land following their victory, Germany now has to suddenly start administering and garrisoning newly conquered territory about 20 times the size of Germany itself. Meanwhile, our subject of this video, the US, is doing amazing. Germany will start repaying their loans, while Britain is still intact, and while economically damaged, Britain and to a lesser extent France will likely eventually economically recover and start paying back their loans to the Americans as well. Meanwhile, America has profited from extremely high prices during the war, bolstering their industry and agriculture even further. After the war ends, American exports start to decline and prices start to drop, slowly reducing the insane margins that America used to enjoy. But the money is already in their pocket, and the American economy is now undoubtedly the biggest economy in the world. And they will be entering the 20s as the most powerful nation on Earth despite their isolation. Now it's just hoping that there won't be a major economic crisis somewhere in the near future. Now, despite how much I want to, I will not go further into detail about this German victory scenario. The video would become 3 times as long as it is now, and I think it's a scenario that deserves its own video one day. So, for now, this is the world map I leave you with. Let me know in the comments how you think this scenario develops from here. If you enjoyed the content, consider subscribing for at least one alternate history video every single week. To help the video grow, consider leaving a like and a comment. It really helps against the algorithm. Even just commenting something simple like hi helps the video out massively. Thank you all for watching, and a special thanks to these patrons who help me dedicate more time and effort to the channel by supporting me monetarily. To help the channel and get early access to videos whenever I complete them myself, consider supporting me there. As an added bonus, you get added to this animation. Also, don't forget to check out our sponsor, Historyware, in the comments below. Again, thank you all for watching, and goodbye.